The year is 1945. The war has ended, and the world is still reeling from the aftermath. In a small German POW camp, women, once soldiers, factory workers, and civilians, now find themselves prisoners, caught in the wreckage of their country's defeat. These women had lived through years of conflict, loss, and fear, only to be left with a sense of hopelessness as their nation crumbled. Now standing before them are American soldiers, the very force that had defeated their homeland. The women are tired, disillusioned, and unsure of what comes next. But then, something unexpected happens. Instead of harsh interrogation or continued punishment, one of the American soldiers speaks softly, offering them something entirely unfamiliar: the chance to learn. "Would you like to try learning how to write?" he asks. The idea seems absurd. In a world where survival had been the only priority, learning had become a distant thought. And yet, as the soldiers begin to set up a makeshift classroom, the women's initial shock gives way to curiosity, then disbelief. A chance to learn, a chance to write. The idea seems so foreign, so out of place after everything they had endured. But in that moment, it is clear, this is more than a lesson in language. It is an opportunity for these women to reclaim their dignity, to rebuild their identities in a world where everything they once knew has been stripped away. What begins as an act of unexpected kindness will transform their lives in ways they could not have imagined. During World War II, the role of German women was deeply shaped by the ideology of the Nazi regime. Women were not only expected to support the war effort, but to embody the ideal of the German mother, nurturing the next generation of soldiers and contributing to the Reich's goals. As the war escalated, women were also recruited for factory labor, nursing, and toward the war's end, many were conscripted to serve in the German military in non-combat roles, such as in auxiliary positions or the Volkssturm, People's Army. For many of these women, the war was a period of both immense sacrifice and ideological conditioning. They were expected to stay loyal to the Führer and contribute to the state's militaristic objectives, often placing their individual desires and freedoms aside. As the war's tide turned against Germany, women found themselves increasingly involved in the defense of their homeland, many of them witnessing or directly experiencing the horrors of bombings, occupation, and the brutal reality of a war that was no longer just about military victory but survival. But by the end of the war in 1945, with Germany's defeat imminent, many German women found themselves on the losing side of history. As the Allies advanced into German territory, women who had once been part of the war effort were now subject to capture. Thousands of women were taken as prisoners of war by the Allies, with many being held in internment camps established by American and other Allied forces. The treatment of these women in captivity was harsh, though not as severe as their male counterparts who were held in POW camps. These women, stripped of their former roles in society, were subjected to both physical and psychological hardship. Many were housed in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, with little food, medical attention, or meaningful labor. They had endured years of wartime deprivation, and now in the aftermath of defeat, they were caught in a liminal space, neither fully civilians nor fully soldiers, left to grapple with the emotional and physical toll of war. While many of the men imprisoned were subjected to harsher conditions, the women were often treated with a combination of indifference and a complex set of expectations from their captors. American military personnel, particularly in the early stages of occupation, were unsure of how to treat the women. They had been part of the enemy, and yet there was a recognition that the war was over, and that these women, like everyone else, were victims of a catastrophic conflict. The aftermath of W2 in Germany was defined by destruction, both physical and psychological. Cities lay in ruins, and the country was divided by occupation forces from the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and the United Kingdom. The process of reconstruction was slow and painful, and the Allied forces, particularly the American military, faced the enormous challenge of both rebuilding a shattered society and attempting to deal with the moral and logistical complexities of their role as occupiers. For the women in the internment camps, liberation was not a celebration. but an overwhelming shift from a life of survival to one of uncertainty. They were suddenly faced with the realization that their country had lost the war, that the Nazis had fallen, and that they too were caught in the wreckage of a failed ideology. The psychological toll of defeat was immense for many of these women, who had been raised to believe in the righteousness of their nation's cause. With defeat came the collapse of their worldview, and for many, it left them adrift, unsure of how to rebuild their lives after years of war and the loss of everything they had known. The American approach to POWs, especially those held in Germany, focused on re-education and rehabilitation. While men were subjected to forced labor and harsh treatment in many cases, the Allies recognized that the female prisoners, many of whom had been subjected to forced labor themselves, required a different approach. In particular, many of the women had been part of the Nazi war machine either through conscription or ideological loyalty, and the question arose of how to rehabilitate them for post-war society. The educational programs introduced by the Allies aimed to help these women rebuild their self-esteem and adapt to a post-war world that no longer had room for the militaristic ideologies that had once defined them. Writing lessons were introduced not just as a form of intellectual education, but as a means of personal empowerment. For many of these women, the ability to write, to communicate, and to express their thoughts represented something much greater than just learning a new skill. It was a path toward self-expression and ultimately self-discovery. The first writing lessons offered to the women were not seen as a mere academic exercise, but as a form of psychological healing. The war had robbed these women of their voice, leaving them to exist in a world defined by suffering and survival. Now, through something as simple as writing, they could reclaim that voice, articulate their experiences, and begin to make sense of a world that had shattered their identity. It was an opportunity for these women to process the trauma they had endured, to share their stories, and to begin the difficult journey of personal reconstruction. For the women imprisoned by the Allies after Germany's defeat, the experience of being offered writing lessons was nothing short of transformative. After years of being treated as objects of war, whether as forced laborers, mothers, or simply victims of circumstance, the act of writing became a powerful reclamation of their humanity. These women, whose lives had been shaped by war and loss, now found themselves offered something unexpected, the chance to express themselves. Before the war, many of these women had been part of a society that deeply emphasized duty, honor, and loyalty to the state. The war had obliterated those structures, and now they were left to face a world where the values that had shaped their lives were gone. The years of deprivation, violence, and ideological submission had taken their toll. To suddenly be given a pen and paper, tools for self-expression and reflection, was a quiet revolution. It was a simple act, yet it allowed these women to regain something vital: their voices. The impact of being given the opportunity to write was profound. Many of these women had been trained to suppress their emotions, to endure the hardships of war without protest, and to put the needs of the state above their own. This conditioning, while part of a nationalistic ideology, left them emotionally numb by the time they were liberated. The ability to write allowed them to break free from this forced silence. It gave them an outlet for the trauma they had suffered, a way to process their experiences without the fear of judgment or persecution. They could now write about their pain, their loss, their guilt, and their survival, all things they had been told to keep to themselves during the war. For some, writing became a form of therapy, a release from the emotional burdens they had carried for years. It wasn't just about learning the mechanics of language or writing in a formal sense. It was about rebuilding their identities and finding their place in a world that had destroyed so much of what they once knew. The very act of writing allowed these women to reclaim their humanity in a way that felt both personal and revolutionary. Writing allowed them to confront their experiences head-on. Many had been forced into supporting roles in the war effort, whether through working in factories, caring for the wounded, or serving in military auxiliaries. Now they could recount those experiences and, in doing so, process the guilt, shame, and confusion they felt. For some, writing became a form of liberation from the trauma of their past. For others, it was a way to communicate the depths of their suffering to others. Through these lessons, they began to see themselves not just as survivors of the war, but as individuals who had endured extraordinary hardship and emerged from it with a renewed sense of agency. In these quiet moments of writing, the women began to heal. They could no longer be defined by their wartime roles or by the dehumanizing experiences they had suffered. They were reclaiming their voices not just for themselves but for future generations. The words they wrote, whether about loss, survival, or fear, were an acknowledgement of their humanity in a world that had tried to erase it. For the American soldiers who offered these writing lessons, the act of giving women the opportunity to write was not just a simple academic task. It was an acknowledgement of the psychological wounds that these women carried, wounds that went beyond the physical and emotional abuse they had endured. It was an understanding that, in order to heal, the women needed to express what had been done to them and what they had done to survive. Offering them this space was an act of compassion and respect, recognizing that the trauma they had experienced needed to be acknowledged and addressed. Through this act, the soldiers were not just offering an education. They were offering a means of healing, an opportunity for these women to break free from the constraints of their past and to begin to rebuild. And in this rebuilding, they were able to find a new sense of self. For the first time in years, these women were no longer defined by the suffering they had endured, but by the words they could write, by the stories they could tell. When the American soldiers offered writing lessons to the German women POWs, they were giving these women far more than an intellectual skill. In a world shattered by war, where every aspect of life had been dominated by violence, fear, and loss, the ability to write was a doorway to self-expression, emotional release, and most importantly, rehabilitation. Writing became a tool of empowerment and recovery for these women, providing them with the opportunity to reclaim their dignity and restore their sense of identity. For many of the German women, the psychological toll of the war and their subsequent captivity had stripped them of their individual identities. During the war, they had been caught in the whirlwind of the Nazi regime's ideology, some as active participants, others as coerced supporters, and were often forced into roles where personal identity was secondary to survival or duty to the state. The years in POW camps had only compounded this loss, as they were treated not as individuals but as enemies to be contained or punished. In this new chapter of their lives after the war had ended, they were given the rare opportunity to redefine themselves, to step out of the shadows of war and begin again. The writing lessons, though seemingly simple, gave these women an invaluable opportunity, the ability to reconnect with themselves. Writing allowed them to articulate their experiences, to express their suffering, to write down the thoughts and feelings that had been silenced for so long. These lessons helped them process their trauma and made them see that they were not defined by the war or by their former roles in the conflict. They were not simply victims of circumstance, but active participants in shaping their own futures. For the American military, the decision to offer educational programs such as these was part of a broader strategy of rehabilitation. At the time, the U.S. recognized that the process of post-war reconciliation and rebuilding would take years and would require more than just physical reconstruction. Education was a means of reformation, helping the former enemy understand the atrocities of the war, promoting peace through knowledge, and encouraging personal reflection. By offering the women writing lessons, the Allies were not just teaching a skill, they were providing a path toward personal growth, intellectual freedom, and a chance to confront the moral complexities of their past actions. In the eyes of the women, receiving an opportunity to learn was not only a form of rehabilitation, but also an act of empowerment. For years, they had lived in a society where education had been weaponized, where knowledge and language were often used to propagate dangerous ideologies. Now, the opportunity to write was a quiet rebellion against that past. It allowed them to reclaim their own voice and begin a new chapter in their lives. Writing became a form of psychological healing. Many of these women had endured unimaginable trauma, the death of loved ones, the loss of homes, and the crushing weight of a nation's defeat. The ability to write allowed them to confront those wounds. Writing was not just about putting words on paper, but about taking control of their narrative, about processing the past and finding a way to move forward. The act of writing enabled these women to reframe their wartime experiences, making sense of the senseless and giving their suffering a voice. For those who had been forced into supporting roles within the Nazi regime, the lessons in writing also provided a space for moral reflection. They had been part of a war machine that devastated millions of lives, and many of them had been raised to believe in the righteousness of their actions. Writing gave them a chance to reflect on the larger moral questions surrounding the war. Some women, through their writing, began to process their own complicity, while others simply sought to understand how their lives had been so profoundly affected by the horrors around them. The psychological benefits of education, especially through writing, were immense. Studies of post-war rehabilitation have long pointed to the importance of allowing individuals to articulate their experiences in the wake of trauma. For the German women POWs, writing lessons were a first step in regaining a sense of control over their lives, over their past, and over their future. The simple act of putting pen to paper allowed them to process, understand, and ultimately heal from the suffering they had endured. The opportunity to write also allowed the women to rebuild their sense of self-worth. In the camps, they had been stripped of nearly everything: their homes, their dignity, and in some cases, their will to live. To be given a pen and paper was a chance to restore a sense of purpose. It was the beginning of reclaiming their humanity. Piece by piece, as they wrote about the pain, the loss, and the resilience that defined their wartime experiences. Through education, these women were offered something far more valuable than simple academic knowledge. They were given the chance to heal, to rediscover their voices, and to rebuild their identities in a world that had been torn apart by war. The writing lessons became a profound tool of recovery, one that helped them rebuild not just their lives but their sense of self-worth. The act of offering writing lessons to German women POWs by American soldiers was not just an educational endeavor, it was a stark cultural clash. These women had spent years living under an oppressive regime that emphasized loyalty, ideology, and nationalistic fervor. To be given the opportunity to write, to explore their thoughts and feelings freely, represented a profound shift not only in their lives but in their worldview. It was a confrontation between the militaristic, hierarchical ideology of Nazi Germany and the democratic, freedom-oriented ideals of post-war America. For many of these women, the lessons were both a gift and a challenge. Having lived in a society that emphasized duty to the state above all else, including the welfare of the individual, they had been taught to suppress personal expression. In Nazi Germany, ideology was carefully controlled, and the concept of independent thought was largely restricted. Women were expected to embody the ideal of the German mother and serve the Reich's objectives without question. Many had been indoctrinated into believing in the supremacy of the state and its cause, which not only required loyalty to the Führer, but also demanded the silence of dissent and the suppression of individuality. The shift from this highly controlled, ideologically rigid society to one where individual expression was encouraged was jarring. The act of writing, of being given the freedom to reflect, analyze, and articulate their own thoughts, was radical. The act of journaling or writing about personal experiences, especially given the history of war and violence they had just lived through, was a direct contradiction to everything they had been taught. In the context of Nazi Germany, such freedoms had been suppressed in favor of a collective identity, one that did not leave room for personal reflection or dissent. The American soldiers who provided these writing lessons may not have fully understood the depth of this cultural clash, but in offering education as part of the post-war rehabilitation, they were making a powerful statement about freedom, democracy, and the dignity of the individual. To them, offering an opportunity to write wasn't just about providing an educational tool. It was about restoring a sense of autonomy to these women, reminding them that they had the right to express themselves, to reflect on their own experiences, and to take control of their futures. For the women, the cultural shift was not instantaneous. Initially, there was confusion, even resistance. Many of the women had been raised to see themselves as part of a collective identity, as loyal citizens of the Reich. The idea of reclaiming their personal stories through writing felt foreign. At first, they may have been reluctant to engage fully in the lessons, unsure of what to make of this sudden opportunity for self-expression. Some were initially hesitant, questioning whether such freedoms were really theirs to take, or if writing might somehow be seen as a betrayal of their national identity. As the lessons progressed, however, the women began to see the opportunity for what it was, a chance to redefine themselves outside of the war's confines. The cultural divide between the Nazi-controlled world they had been part of and the Freedom offered by the American soldiers could not have been starker. Writing lessons became a bridge between these two worlds, offering a way for the women to move from a collective wartime identity to one of individual autonomy and personal healing. The cultural clash was also evident in the way the women approached the concept of learning. Under Nazi rule, the education system had been highly ideological, focused on producing citizens who were loyal to the state. To suddenly be asked to think for themselves, to explore their personal experiences and emotions through writing was an opportunity that many of them had never considered possible. For some, it was liberating. For others, it was frightening. The idea of having their thoughts, their feelings, their personal experiences validated through writing was as foreign to them as the American beds they had first slept in. The writing lessons became a symbol of a larger ideological shift. They were no longer prisoners of war, victims of the ideological machine that had governed their lives. They were free individuals, with the right to express themselves, to write their own history, and to reflect on their actions, thoughts, and emotions. In the context of post-war reconciliation, this shift in perspective was vital not only for these women, but for the broader process of rebuilding a world that had been fractured by ideology. This cultural clash, the tension between Nazi Germany's authoritarian, dehumanizing system and the democratic, freedom-oriented ideals of post-war America, was not just about the difference in political systems, but about a confrontation of fundamental values. Individual identity versus collective identity, freedom of expression versus state control. The simple act of offering writing lessons was a quiet yet profound act of rebellion against the past. It provided the women with the tools to think for themselves, to question their past roles in the war, and to imagine a future in which they could define their own identities. In the broader context of post-war reconstruction, these moments of personal empowerment, like the writing lessons, were part of a larger effort to reshape societies that had been devastated by war. The American efforts to offer not just physical rehabilitation, but intellectual and emotional recovery were key to rebuilding a Europe and a Germany that would eventually move away from the ideologies of hate and intolerance that had fueled the war. The cultural clash between the old world of Nazi ideology and the new world of American democracy was significant not only for the women learning to write, but for the future of Europe as a whole. The turning point came not with a dramatic battle or moment of military action, but in a quiet classroom, where the first writing lesson began. These lessons, seemingly simple on the surface, had profound implications for the women prisoners. The idea of writing, of expressing their thoughts freely, was something that many of these women had never experienced before. Having been raised under a regime that restricted thought and punished dissent, the freedom to explore their own ideas on paper was not just an intellectual opportunity. It was a moment of personal liberation. The first writing lesson began with tentative steps, women unsure of how to hold the pen, hesitant to write down their thoughts. After years of wartime dehumanization, the idea that their words mattered, that they could form and communicate their own perspectives, was difficult to grasp. The very act of writing was not just an academic exercise for them, but a radical shift in how they viewed themselves. They had been prisoners of war, stripped of their identities and their rights. Now they were being asked to rebuild those identities, to reclaim the very agency that had been taken from them. The classroom, humble and makeshift, was where this profound transformation began. The first few lessons were filled with hesitation. The women looked at each other, unsure of what to write or how to begin. Many had been taught to suppress their feelings and thoughts for years. But over time, something began to change. As they wrote, some began to express their fears, their grief, their guilt. They wrote about the war, about their suffering, and about the uncertainty of their future. The simple act of putting pen to paper gave them a chance to make sense of their trauma and to reflect on their experiences in ways they had never been able to before. For the women, this shift was not immediate. Writing, after all, was not just a means of communication. It was a mirror into their own souls. For some, it was a way to process their role in the war, their connection to the Nazi regime, and their complicity in the suffering of others. For others, it was simply a way to release the heavy emotional burden of captivity and defeat. Yet the writing process gradually became a catharsis. a quiet revolution in how they understood themselves, their past, and their futures. They were no longer just victims or enemies. They were individuals with the capacity for reflection, understanding, and, eventually, healing. The first breakthrough moment occurred when one of the women, who had been particularly quiet and withdrawn, raised her hand. She shared a passage of writing with the group, a story of her childhood before the war. She spoke of innocence lost, of a time when life had been simpler and free from the ideology that had torn her world apart. Her voice was steady but emotional. It was a moment of revelation, not only for her but for the others in the room. This was the power of writing. It allowed them to reconnect with a lost part of themselves, to rediscover the humanity that had been buried beneath layers of trauma and national ideology. For the American soldiers offering the lessons, it was also a moment of profound realization. The gesture they had thought of as merely educational was having a far deeper impact than they could have anticipated. They had come to see these women as enemies, as the instigators of a war that had brought destruction to millions. But as they watched the women open up and begin to express themselves, the soldiers understood that they were not just dealing with former combatants. They were dealing with human beings who had been caught in the same devastating conflict. The writing lessons allowed both the women and the soldiers to see each other differently. The boundaries that war had drawn between them began to blur. In the quiet exchange of words on paper, they found a common humanity. The real turning point came when these women, once so isolated in their suffering, began to write about their hopes for the future. The lessons in writing, which had started as simple academic tasks, became a pathway to understanding themselves and their place in a post-war world. For many, the lessons gave them a voice they had long been denied, a chance to be heard in a way that went beyond the roles they had played in the war. They could now tell their stories, reflect on their suffering, and begin the process of rebuilding their lives. In that moment, writing became more than an act of communication. It became an act of self-liberation. The women prisoners, once defined by their wartime experiences and their roles within the Nazi machine, were now reclaiming their individuality, their voices, and their agency. For the American soldiers, the writing lessons were not just an educational gesture. They were a tool for reconciliation and understanding, an acknowledgement that, even after the horrors of war, there was still room for compassion, for humanity, and for healing. This small act of kindness, the gift of writing, was more than a moment of education. It was a pivotal turning point in the lives of these women, one that allowed them to step out of the shadows of war and into the light of self-determination, identity, and hope. The writing lessons offered to the German women POWs were a pivotal moment in their post-war recovery. Yet the effects of this act extended far beyond the classroom. These lessons represented a first step in reclaiming their voices, but the emotional and psychological transformation they sparked would take years to unfold. The women who had once been defined by their wartime roles, shaped by the demands and horrors of the conflict, now found themselves on a new path, one where they were no longer merely victims of war but individuals with agency, capable of expressing and processing their experiences. For many of the women, the opportunity to write was a quiet but profound moment of liberation. It allowed them to reflect on the trauma they had endured, but it also gave them the space to consider their futures. Writing became a process of both remembering and imagining. They wrote about the past, about their lives before the war, their families, their losses, and about the present, about survival, suffering, and the complicated feelings of guilt and shame they carried. In the process, they also began to think about what could come next. The lessons, which had initially seemed like a simple academic task, became a way for these women to confront their emotional pain, process their grief, and slowly rebuild their identities in a post-war world. However, the journey of healing was not without its difficulties. Many of these women had spent years in captivity, enduring physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. The scars of those years were deep, and while the writing lessons helped them begin the process of understanding and healing, it did not immediately erase the pain. For some, writing was a way to confront the feelings they had buried deep within themselves. It was not always easy. Many women struggled with feelings of shame and isolation, unable to reconcile their wartime experiences with the idea of their own worth. The post-war years were filled with challenges as the women returned to their families. communities and societies that had been forever altered by the war. For some, reintegrating into civilian life was difficult. They had been away from their homes for so long that they found it hard to reconnect with a world that had moved on without them. The emotional scars of captivity, the shame of being women prisoners of war, and the societal expectations placed on them as survivors all combined to create a sense of alienation. But for many, the act of writing helped bridge that gap. It gave them the tools to articulate their experiences in a way that others could understand. Some of these women wrote letters to their families, expressing feelings of loss, guilt, and fear. Others wrote personal journals, creating a space where they could document their struggles and their hopes for the future. Writing was no longer just about learning a skill. It had become a method of personal discovery and emotional release. Through writing, they could communicate their pain and begin to heal. For some, the writing lessons sparked a broader interest in education and self-improvement. Many of the women who had been given this unexpected opportunity to learn now sought further education, eager to rebuild their lives and contribute to a world that was slowly but surely emerging from the shadows of war. The lessons they had received served as a reminder that, despite the horrors of their past, they had the ability to shape their futures. They could learn, they could grow, and they could contribute to the rebuilding of a society that had once torn them apart. In the years that followed, these women began to play a key role in Germany's post-war recovery. Some became active in supporting the rehabilitation of other survivors, advocating for the recognition of the unique struggles faced by female POWs. They also began to contribute to the shifting role of women in post-war Germany, where the traditional roles of women had been challenged by the war and its aftermath. Through their writing and their advocacy, these women helped to reshape the narrative of the war, one that had often marginalized their experiences. The lessons, though humble in their intent, became a profound catalyst for change. For the women POWs, they were not just an academic pursuit. They were an act of self-liberation, an opportunity to reclaim their dignity and agency after years of oppression. Through the written word, they were able to confront their past, rebuild their identities, and step into a future that had once seemed impossible. The writing lessons provided to the German women POWs had broader, long-lasting effects that extended beyond the immediate emotional and psychological healing of these women. They were part of a larger effort by the Allied forces, particularly the Americans, to reshape post-war Europe, focusing not just on the physical reconstruction of the cities, but on the intellectual and cultural rehabilitation of a society devastated by war. The lessons, simple yet powerful, became a model for how education and intellectual engagement could play a role in post-conflict healing. Following Germany's defeat, the country was left in ruins. The American military, occupying parts of Germany, was tasked with not only providing basic relief but also with the moral and intellectual rehabilitation of the German population. The Allies recognized that rebuilding Germany would require more than just the restoration of infrastructure. It would require a shift in the collective mindset of the German people. Many Germans, particularly those involved with the Nazi regime, had been taught to accept totalitarianism, blind obedience, and militaristic ideologies. A fundamental part of the post-war effort was to reintroduce the ideals of democracy, human rights, and intellectual freedom. The educational programs offered to former POWs, including the writing lessons, were a key component of this broader rehabilitation. These lessons were not just about teaching language or writing. They were about allowing these individuals to engage in critical thinking, to reflect on their past actions, and to process the trauma of war in a way that could lead to personal transformation. For the women prisoners, writing was a means of confronting the war's psychological toll, but it also introduced them to new ways of thinking about their future roles in society. The ability to reflect, to analyze, and to articulate their experiences through writing was an act of intellectual freedom that had been denied to them under the Nazi regime. The American soldiers who offered these lessons likely did not anticipate the profound impact their actions would have. What started as an effort to provide basic education for liberated POWs became part of a larger cultural reorientation. For many of the women, the opportunity to write helped them reframe their wartime experiences, to understand their complicity or victimhood, and to navigate the complexities of a post-war world. They were given the opportunity to be active participants in their own recovery, and their ability to write about their experiences gave them a sense of control and agency that they had been denied during the war. As these women began to process their trauma through writing, their experiences highlighted the importance of education in the rehabilitation process. Writing allowed them to reconnect with themselves and their pasts, but it also made them capable of envisioning a new future. The act of writing was not just about reflecting on their own suffering. It was about understanding the larger social, political, and cultural forces that had shaped their lives and the war itself. In writing about their past, many women began to envision new possibilities for their futures, contributing to the broader cultural shift that was taking place in post-war Germany. The success of these educational programs influenced the broader approach to rehabilitation in post-war Germany and beyond. The idea that intellectual engagement, the ability to think critically, reflect on the past, and articulate one's thoughts, could play a role in healing became a core principle in the reconstruction of not just German society, but also the post-war global order. In the years following the war, similar educational programs were established for other groups, including former soldiers, civilians, and even in the context of the denazification efforts. These programs sought to move people away from the rigid, nationalistic ideologies that had dominated Europe during the war, and to introduce new ways of thinking about human rights, democracy, and the individual. Furthermore, the American approach to rehabilitating women POWs was a precursor to the broader recognition of the importance of education in post-conflict societies. The lessons learned from these women's experiences contributed to a larger understanding of how education can serve as a tool for healing, reconciliation, and transformation. It demonstrated that even in the aftermath of war, it was possible to restore dignity, autonomy, and hope through intellectual engagement. In time, as Germany and other European nations recovered from the devastation of war, the importance of educational programs as a form of rehabilitation became an accepted part of the post-war reconstruction process. These programs not only helped people rebuild their lives, but also played a significant role in reshaping the ideological landscape of Europe, fostering a new era of thought, empathy, and cooperation. For the women who had received these writing lessons, their stories became part of this larger shift. Many of them, having regained their voices through writing, used their newfound skills to speak out about their experiences and to advocate for the recognition of other women who had suffered during the war. Their efforts helped ensure that the women's experiences in captivity were no longer overlooked, and their stories contributed to the broader understanding of the psychological and cultural costs of the war. The story of the German women POWs receiving writing lessons from American soldiers is not just a tale of post-war rehabilitation. It is a powerful reminder of the transformative potential of education and compassion in the aftermath of conflict. After years of suffering, deprivation, and ideological conditioning, these women were offered an opportunity to reclaim their voices, something they had been denied under the Nazi regime and throughout the war. Writing lessons, simple as they may seem, became a pathway to healing, personal reflection, and empowerment. In a world that had been torn apart by violence and hate, the opportunity to learn and to express themselves symbolized the possibility of a new beginning. For many of these women, the act of writing was not just an academic pursuit. It was an emotional release, a chance to reflect on their trauma and make sense of the chaos and suffering they had endured. It allowed them to confront the past, process their roles in the war, and imagine a future that was no longer defined by their victimhood or their complicity, but by their agency, resilience, and humanity. The cultural clash between the rigid, nationalistic ideologies of Nazi Germany and the democratic, freedom-oriented ideals of post-war America was evident in these lessons. For the women who had been raised in a society where personal thought was suppressed and obedience to the state was paramount, the freedom to write and to think independently was both liberating and challenging. Yet, this very freedom was key to their rehabilitation, not just as survivors of war, but as individuals capable of shaping their own narratives, reflecting on their pasts, and building a future on their own terms. The simple act of writing, given to these women as a form of education, became much more than an intellectual exercise. It was a revolutionary opportunity to rebuild their identities, to reassert their dignity, and to step into a post-war world not as defeated victims but as human beings with a voice, a past, and the ability to shape their own futures. Through writing, they were able to heal, to process their trauma, and to transform their pain into something powerful and productive. In the years that followed, the lessons learned in those makeshift classrooms helped these women rebuild their lives. They shared their stories, advocated for the recognition of women POWs, and contributed to the reconstruction of a society that had been irreparably altered by war. The impact of those writing lessons extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of liberation. They were part of a larger movement toward personal and societal recovery, where education, empathy, and understanding became crucial tools in rebuilding the fractured post-war world. The story of these women and their writing lessons serves as a profound reminder that, even in the darkest times, the potential for growth, understanding, and healing remains. In the end, it is not just the battles won or lost that define us, but the capacity for compassion, for offering opportunities to reclaim dignity, and for recognizing the humanity in those we might consider enemies. Education, in its purest form, becomes a tool not only for intellectual growth but for personal liberation and emotional healing. In a world still scarred by the horrors of war, the act of offering a pen and paper, the chance to write, became an act of peace, a small but significant step toward reconciliation, understanding, and rebuilding a shared human future.